This is Dr. Ted Hildebrandt in his New Testament History, Literature, and Theology course, lecture number 6, on the beginning features of the book of Matthew.
Well, welcome back to New Testament History, Literature, and Theology course. We, having done the background, the Persians, the Greeks, the Maccabees, the Romans, down to Herod, and then jumping into, last time, the inspiration question, the canonicity or collection process, the transcription process of copying over and over again by the scribes and how we weigh that out. And then last time we talked about translations and the different translations and how that's done. So we've done inspiration, canonicity, transmission, and translation. And now, finally, at last, we're ready for the book of Matthew. And so today is kind of a great start. We're going to jump into the book of Matthew and look at some of the bigger picture of the book of Matthew. We won't be able to go through it in detail, obviously, but we'll be able to get a feel, sense for the book. So I want to start out Matthew's Gospel. And basically, Matthew's story is, and I would like to organize our whole discussion on these themes of Matthew according to this kind of acrostic here. And so basically what I'm going to say is Matthew is methodical. And basically how we'll get Matthew as methodical is we have two other Gospels, Mark and Luke. And so we'll compare Matthew to Mark and Luke and see what are the differences between them. And I want to suggest that Matthew is methodical. By the way, just starting up with these three Gospels, we've actually got four Gospels, right? We've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those three are called the Synoptic Gospels. We'll get into this later. Synoptic means with one eye. In other words, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all seem to see Jesus through this one perspective. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's why they're called the Synoptic Gospels. With one eye, they see Jesus. The other Gospel, John, sees Christ very differently. Like over 90% or so of the Gospel of John is totally different than the Matthew, Mark, and Luke stories. So you get a totally different perspective. And some people are bothered, and we'll show you some of the differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, of course. And some people are bothered by the differences. I look at the differences, and I thank God for the differences. Will people tell stories differently? Will people tell stories differently? And so Matthew is a tax collector. He's going to tell the story differently than Mark, who was apparently a young man at the time that Jesus and was from Jerusalem. Luke never met Jesus. Luke is going to be more of a historian, a doctor. And so his perspective is going to be very different than a John, who was a fisherman whom Jesus called by the Sea of Galilee. So you have these four different people with their different perspectives. So each of them, from the author's point of view, has a different perspective on Jesus and what they picked up in the life of Jesus. And then also, what type of audience are they addressing? You tell the story differently according from the audience that you're addressing. One of the classics for me as far as a person telling stories is my son, who just got back from Afghanistan. And he was telling stories in the family, and our children were there, and so he told stories, and he's a great storyteller, and so they're laughing and having fun, and it's just the stories crack you up, and they're just really funny stories, and so the kids are all laughing, we're all laughing at the stories and things, and the kids then went out to pick up my other son, Zach, at the airport, and as soon as the kids left the room, my son started telling my wife and I, it was just my wife and I, different stories, and instead of laughing, there were stories that almost had us crying. And so what I'm saying is you tell stories, and actually you can tell the same story. And I've heard some of his stories, I've heard several times now. And as I hear it 3 times, I hear him tell it to different audiences. He's emphasizing different things. And then when you're alone in the car with him, and then all of a sudden he tells you the real reason behind all those stories, it connects it all up. And so people tell stories differently, and you just got to... Rather than seeing and try to have a monolithic where, all the stories are exactly the same, the church didn't want that. The church wanted the different stories of Jesus to be told. And so it's kind of like, why do you have 2 eyes? If you're blind in one eye, you don't have any depth perception. And so you have 2 eyes, and they're actually having cameras now, video cameras with 2 lenses up front, so that you can actually get this depth of field, this 3D sense. And so with Jesus, you've got 4 Gospels giving 4 different takes on Jesus. And of course, John says, if we were to write everything Jesus said and did down, all the books in the world couldn't contain this. So we're getting 4 different snapshots and perspectives on Jesus, and that's helpful. So when we come to places of conflict between the Gospels, don't throw up your hands and say, oh, conflict bothers you. No, that's wonderful. That's what we want to be able to see, the different perspectives on Jesus. And so Matthew is methodical when we compare him to Mark and Luke, and we'll go into that later in a second. Here's the second thing we want to look at, is that the Gospel of Matthew is apostling. Now, I did that so I could get an A out of it, but actually Matthew talks about discipleship. Discipleship is a major theme in the book. Jesus is portrayed as a teacher in the book of Matthew. He's kind of viewed as a kind of a second Moses, a new Moses, so that you get this new Moses motif, and Jesus is the new Moses giving his teaching to his disciples. And so what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus Christ? Matthew will develop that thing as the teacher Jesus calls his disciples. And so we have the discipleship or the apostling. And then we'll talk about the theology of Christ. What theology of Christ, and as we'll look at, some of you know the picture scripture things, we portray Jesus Christ is portrayed as king. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, it says, Jesus Christ, the Son of David. Why does Matthew start out with Jesus Christ, the Son of David, the son of Abraham, the son of David? He starts out with David because he's going to portray Jesus as king. In the book of Matthew, will portray Jesus as this son of David, this Christ. Then we'll also look at time. The book of Matthew will have very much regard to the past. Matthew, more than any other gospel, will quote from the Old Testament. He's writing probably to a Jewish audience. And so he'll quote a lot of things from the Old Testament, from the past. He will tell us about Jesus in the present. He will give us the great 5 sermons of Jesus, 5 discourses of Jesus, kind of like almost a new Pentateuch of the Moses. Jesus will give us 5 Pentateuch. You know the Sermon on the Mount and the Olivet Discourse. Jesus also in the book of Matthew in the Olivet Discourse will focus a couple chapters, whole chapters, on the future. And so how does the future connect with the present? How does the coming kingdom compare with the kingdom that is within us now? And so Matthew will have this tension that we'll call, Dr. Dave Mathewson, that used to teach here at Gordon College, always loved to say, the already but not yet. And he pulled from, I believe it was George Eldon Ladd, but the already but not yet. And so there'll be this tension in the gospel between the already, which already exists in the church, and that which is yet to come. And so you'll get this tension between the already and not yet. We'll look at that in terms of how Matthew covers this time perspective. And then H, we'll show the Hebrew perspective of the book. The book of Matthew is very Hebrew-oriented, Jewish-oriented. It's a very Jewish, the audience was probably Jewish. Some people even said that the book of Matthew they thought was written in Aramaic originally and translated into Greek. Pros and cons on that, it's argued. But it seems to be written to a Jewish audience, a Hebrew audience, Hebrew orientation. While it's written to a Jewish audience, the book also breaks out and is extensive in terms of its covering of the Gentiles, okay, of people who are non-Jewish. And so it's extensive in that there's this non-Jewish aspect of the book that always keeps getting pushed. And we'll go over some of that non-Jewish aspect. And then the witness. The beginning of the gospel and the end of the gospel tells us that we are to be witnesses to Christ and go make disciples and things. And so we'll look at the notion of witness. And then lastly, just briefly, we'll look at Matthew's style. What is his style of writing as compared to the other gospel writers? And so this is, I don't know whether you can see it, Matthew. And so what we've got here is Matthews with an S on the end. And this will organize this thing for us and just as we go through. Sorry for the goofy acrostic, but this is, to be honest, this is how I remember the things.